I think we made a connection. That is nice. It is a nice
Yeah,
feeling,
it's
isn't
rare.
it? You know?
Thank you for saying that.
It is a rare feeling.
It is
a rare feeling. You know.
Mental impact in these troubled times?
Excuse me?
Kidding.
It's just so much fun. You know what? I think our interview's gonna last about 2 seconds.
I know. Whoa. So this movie is...
Some roles don't just demand preparation. They demand surrender. They ask the actor to go places that aren't safe, to sit with emotions most people spend their lives avoiding, and to blur the line between performance and identity. Most scripts can be stepped away from at the end of the day. This one couldn't. The transformation didn't happen in front of the camera. It began long before the first scene was shot, through isolation, physical depletion, and a deliberate descent into discomfort. Weight was stripped away. Routines disappeared. Even laughter began to feel foreign. What made this role different wasn't the darkness on the page. It was how deeply that darkness needed to be internalized to feel real. There were moments when the boundary between character and self grew dangerously thin, when the silence offset felt heavier than the scenes being filmed. This wasn't method acting for show. It was immersion with consequences. For Joaquin Phoenix, playing the Joker wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about letting parts of himself surface that he normally kept buried, and staying there long enough to make them believable. And by the time the film was complete, the real challenge wasn't delivering the performance. It was finding his way back out of it. From the outside, it looked like dedication. The kind critics admire and audiences romanticize. A transformation so extreme it felt like proof of artistic seriousness. But inside the process, it felt very different. This wasn't a role that could be turned on and off. Long before the cameras started rolling, preparation became isolation. Days narrowed into routines that revolved around control, of food, of movement, of thought. Weight loss wasn't just physical, it was psychological. As the body weakened, emotions sharpened. Irritability replaced patience. Silence replaced ease. That was intentional. The character demanded fragility, not just in posture, but in perception. To make that believable, comfort had to disappear. Familiar habits were stripped away. Social interactions became rare. Laughter felt out of place, almost intrusive against the internal atmosphere being cultivated. The danger in this approach isn't obvious at first. It hides behind discipline, behind commitment, behind praise for going all in. But immersion has a cost when the character you're inhabiting is defined by alienation and psychological fracture. And this character lived there constantly. Unlike traditional antagonists, this role wasn't fueled by rage or power. It was fueled by loneliness, rejection, and a slow erosion of self-worth. To portray that honestly required proximity, too close for comfort. What made the process especially destabilizing was the lack of clear emotional relief. There were no heroic arcs to balance the darkness, no moments of redemption to reset perspective. The narrative moved downward, inward, tightening with each scene. That descent began to shape daily life. As filming progressed, the boundary between preparation and existence blurred. The character's physicality, awkward, hunched, deliberate, began to linger off-camera. Movements slowed. Speech became more measured. Energy dropped. This wasn't performance bleeding into life. It was life being reorganized around performance. On set, unpredictability became part of the process. Scenes evolved in real time. Emotional beats weren't always planned. That uncertainty kept everyone slightly off balance, and that was the point. Comfort would have undermined authenticity, but living in that state takes a toll. There were moments of doubt, moments where the process felt unsustainable, where the silence offset felt heavier than the scenes themselves. The character's worldview, bleak, distorted, wounded, began to feel persistent rather than temporary. That persistence is where things get risky. When you spend enough time inside a fractured perspective, it stops feeling foreign. The logic begins to make sense, not intellectually, but emotionally. And that emotional familiarity is hard to undo. This wasn't about losing touch with reality in a dramatic way. It was subtler than that. A narrowing of emotional range. A growing difficulty transitioning back into normal interactions. A sense that ordinary life felt distant, even artificial. The body followed the mind. Physical weakness amplified emotional volatility. Exhaustion lowered resistance. The combination created a feedback loop. Mental strain feeding physical depletion, which fed further mental strain. And all of it was happening under the pressure of expectation. This wasn't just another film. It was a cultural risk, a controversial reinterpretation of an iconic figure. Scrutiny arrived early, speculation followed, every detail was analyzed before the film was finished. That external pressure layered on top of internal strain. Yet stopping wasn't an option. Once immersed at that depth, stepping away feels dangerous. Not because the character might be lost, but because leaving abruptly can feel like rupture. Like abandoning something unfinished that has already rearranged your internal state. So the process continued. Days blurred together. Emotional recovery was postponed. The goal narrowed to one thing: truth on screen, regardless of cost. That singular focus can be clarifying, but it can also be consuming. This is the paradox of extreme performance. The very intensity that produces something powerful can also destabilize the person creating it. And the industry doesn't always know how to intervene. There's admiration for commitment, but little infrastructure for containment. As long as the work progresses, concern remains secondary. The irony is that this concern often surfaces only in hindsight. After the performance is praised, after the awards are handed out, after the toll has already been paid. By the later stages of filming, the character's presence felt constant. Not intrusive, but persistent. It lingered in posture, in tone, in emotional response. The separation that usually marks the end of a workday felt incomplete. Finding the way back required time that didn't exist yet. Because the work wasn't finished. The most intense scenes still lay ahead. Scenes that demanded full emotional exposure. Scenes that required surrender without protection. Scenes that pushed vulnerability past rehearsal and into something raw. This is where the idea of almost losing oneself becomes meaningful, not as a dramatic headline, but as a lived experience. A slow drift rather than a sudden break. A prolonged stay in an emotional landscape that was never meant to be permanent. The character didn't just ask to be portrayed, he asked to be inhabited. And habitation, when extended too long, leaves residue. By the time the final scenes approached, the challenge was no longer about accessing darkness. It was about not letting that darkness become the default state. That balance, between authenticity and self-preservation, is where many performances falter. Either the portrayal becomes safe, or the cost becomes excessive. This one walked that line uncomfortably closely. As filming moved deeper into its most demanding phase, the emotional weight stopped building and began to compress. Scenes were no longer isolated challenges. They fed into one another, stacking tension without release. What made this especially destabilizing was that many of the most intense moments weren't written to provide relief. They were written to escalate. There was no emotional reset button. The character's world was designed to reject him at every turn. Indifference, mockery, violence. Each interaction reinforced a sense of erasure. To perform that convincingly required not just imagining rejection, but feeling it, again and again, until it became familiar. That familiarity is where the risk intensified. Because when emotional pain is rehearsed repeatedly, it can lose its edges. It stops feeling foreign. The nervous system adapts. And once adaptation sets in, separating performance from internal response becomes increasingly difficult. Some scenes demanded a level of exposure that left no room for technique. There was no distance to hide behind, no stylization to soften impact. The camera stayed close. The silences were long. Every movement, every breath, every hesitation mattered. In those moments, acting stopped being a craft and became endurance. Between takes, there was little decompression. The physical transformation had already stripped away reserves. Energy was limited. Emotions remained close to the surface. Small disruptions felt amplified. Even routine adjustments carried disproportionate weight. This wasn't volatility for spectacle, it was fragility under sustained pressure. The environment itself reinforced it. The production encouraged exploration, spontaneity, unpredictability. Scenes were allowed to evolve. Dialogue shifted. Blocking changed. That freedom enhanced realism, but it also removed predictability. Predictability is safety. Without it, the nervous system stays alert. And staying alert for extended periods leads to exhaustion. not just physical, but cognitive and emotional. Decision-making becomes heavier. Transitions become harder. Rest becomes shallow. That exhaustion didn't stop when the cameras cut. The character's emotional posture lingered into offset moments. Isolation deepened. Social interactions felt effortful. There was a growing sense of being misaligned with the world outside the film's atmosphere. This misalignment wasn't dramatic or obvious. It didn't manifest as breakdowns or public incidents. It manifested as disconnection, a quiet narrowing of focus, a feeling that ordinary life was happening at a distance. That distance is dangerous when it becomes comfortable, because comfort and disconnection can be mistaken for control. As the production progressed, concern existed, but it was unspoken. The industry often struggles with this moment. When a performance is clearly working, questioning the process feels like interference. There's an unspoken belief that disruption could compromise the result, so the work continues, and the cost is deferred. One of the most challenging aspects of this process was the absence of a moral anchor within the character. There was no internal compass guiding actions toward resolution. Everything spiraled inward. To inhabit that fully required suspending judgment, not evaluating behavior, but embodying it. Suspension of judgment is necessary for authenticity, but prolonged suspension can blur values. That doesn't mean beliefs disappear, it means access to them weakens. Emotional responses flatten or skew, perspective narrows, and when perspective narrows, the world feels more hostile than it actually is. This is where the line between immersion and erosion becomes thin. The body reflected this erosion. Weight loss altered posture and energy. Fatigue slowed reaction time. Hunger sharpened irritability. The physical state amplified the emotional state, creating a loop that was difficult to interrupt. Breaking that loop required something the process didn't allow: distance. There was no time for distance. Schedules were tight. Scenes were demanding. Expectations were high. And stepping back, even briefly, felt like abandoning momentum. Momentum, once established, is difficult to stop. By the later stages of filming, the performance had achieved exactly what it set out to do. It was unsettling, uncomfortable, intimate in a way that made viewers feel complicit rather than entertained. But achieving that effect meant staying inside a psychological space that was never meant to be permanent. This is the paradox at the center of extreme character work. To portray disintegration convincingly, you must approach it closely. But proximity carries risk. And the longer you remain there, the more effort it takes to return. The end of filming didn't immediately bring relief. There was no switch to flip, no instant re-entry into normalcy. The routines that had been stripped away didn't return automatically. The body needed recovery. The mind needed recalibration. And recalibration takes time. In the absence of immediate structure, the residue of the character lingered. Not as hallucination or confusion, but as emotional inertia. A heaviness that took effort to move through. A sense that the role had rearranged internal reference points. This is where many performers struggle. The industry celebrates transformation, but rarely discusses recovery. There's admiration for how far someone is willing to go, but little attention paid to how they come back. Yet coming back is often the harder part. Because the work may be finished, but the imprint remains. Over time, normal rhythms began to return. Eating stabilized, energy rebuilt, distance grew, but the process left its mark, not as damage, but as awareness. Awareness of limits, awareness of cost, awareness of how easily dedication can slip into self-erasure. This awareness doesn't negate the achievement, it contextualizes it. The performance wasn't the result of losing oneself entirely. It was the result of approaching that edge closely enough to understand it and stepping away before it became permanent. That distinction matters, because the story isn't about someone being consumed by a role. It's about how close that consumption came and what it revealed about the system that encourages it. When the filming finally ended, there was no sense of closure, no emotional exhale that signaled completion. Instead, there was an unfamiliar stillness, one that felt heavier than the chaos that preceded it. The structure that had governed every day was suddenly gone, and with it, the justification for remaining in such an extreme internal state. This is the phase most people never see. Preparation is admired. Performance is celebrated. But the aftermath is quiet, private, and rarely discussed. It's where the real consequences surface. Stepping away from a character like this isn't as simple as returning to routine. The habits built to sustain the role don't dissolve overnight. The body needs to relearn balance. The mind needs to re-expand its emotional range. And that process can feel disorienting. For a long time, everything had been narrowed intentionally. Food, movement, interaction, thought. The world had been reduced to what served the character. When that constraint lifts, it doesn't immediately feel liberating. It feels overwhelming. Ordinary stimuli return all at once. Conversations feel louder. Spaces feel fuller. Emotions that were suppressed begin resurfacing without order. There's relief, but also vulnerability. Because the internal armor that helped endure the process has not yet been put down. This is where reflection begins. Not the reflective interviews or award season narratives, but private reckoning. Questions about cost, about sustainability, about how close is too close when inhabiting someone else's pain. The performance had achieved its goal. It was unsettling, intimate, and deeply human. But achievement doesn't erase consequence. It simply postpones the moment when those consequences must be addressed. And they were. The experience forced a recalibration of boundaries, a reassessment of what commitment really means. There's a difference between dedication and self-erasure, and that difference becomes clearer only after you've crossed it. The industry often frames extreme immersion as courage, but courage without containment can become damage, and this process exposed just how thin that line really is. What's rarely acknowledged is that not all characters ask the same price. Some roles require technical skill, others require emotional vulnerability, and a few demand sustained exposure to psychological fracture. Those roles don't just test talent, they test resilience. The aftermath wasn't about regret. There was no disavowal of the work, but there was awareness. A quiet understanding that going forward, the approach would need to evolve. That intensity without safeguards is not something to repeat lightly. This awareness didn't arrive as a public declaration. It emerged internally, shaping future decisions in subtle ways. Choices about pacing, about process, about when to push and when to pull back. Because the truth is, losing yourself isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it looks like gradual narrowing, like living in a reduced emotional bandwidth for too long, like forgetting what neutral feels like. And recovery means expanding again, slowly, deliberately. Over time, normalcy returned. Not instantly, but steadily. The body regained strength. Social rhythms re-established themselves. Distance from the character increased. And with that distance came perspective. Perspective reframes memory. The experience stopped feeling like a descent and started feeling like a passage. Difficult, yes, but also clarifying. It revealed limits that hadn't been tested before. And knowing those limits is a form of protection. What remained was respect for the process, but not romanticization of it. There's a tendency to mythologize suffering in art. To believe that the more painful the process, the more authentic the result. But authenticity doesn't require destruction. It requires honesty. And honesty can be achieved in many ways. This realization reshaped how commitment was defined. Going all in no longer meant abandoning stability. It meant choosing methods that preserved long-term capacity. Because a career built on depletion is short-lived no matter how brilliant its peaks. The performance stands as a testament to what immersion can achieve, but also as a reminder of why it must be handled with care. Not every truth requires total surrender. Not every character deserves unrestricted access. This is where the story shifts from fascination to understanding. The near loss wasn't about identity disappearing completely. It was about how close prolonged exposure came to blurring essential boundaries, and recognizing that proximity was the real lesson. Art demands vulnerability, but vulnerability without recovery becomes erosion. That lesson doesn't diminish the work, it contextualizes it. It turns a singular achievement into a marker of growth rather than a blueprint to repeat. In the end, the most important outcome wasn't acclaim or recognition, it was insight. Insight into how the mind adapts under pressure, how the body responds to deprivation, and how easily dedication can slide into imbalance when safeguards are absent. This wasn't a story of someone being consumed, it was a story of someone approaching the edge closely enough to understand what it costs, and stepping back with that knowledge intact. And that distinction matters. Because losing yourself completely isn't what makes a performance powerful. Knowing how to come back is. With distance, the experience stopped feeling like a risk narrowly avoided and began to feel like a boundary clearly revealed. Not a warning meant to frighten, but a limit meant to be respected. What this role ultimately exposed was not fragility, but sensitivity, the kind that allows someone to access emotional truth without numbing themselves to it. Sensitivity is often mistaken for weakness in an industry that glorifies endurance. But endurance without awareness is what leads people to disappear inside their work. The performance succeeded because it went close, but not because it went too far. That distinction is easy to miss. The character demanded immersion, but the aftermath demanded reflection. And reflection reshaped the understanding of what commitment should look like going forward. Not as self-denial, not as prolonged suffering, but as intentional engagement with clear exit points. This wasn't about avoiding darkness in future roles. Darkness is part of honest storytelling. It was about refusing to live there longer than necessary. What remains now is not a fear of transformation, but a respect for its cost. The knowledge that accessing extreme emotional states requires recovery just as physical strain does. That intensity without recovery doesn't produce depth, it produces depletion. This understanding quietly changes everything. It shifts how success is measured. Not by how much you're willing to sacrifice, but by how sustainably you can continue. Not by how completely you disappear into a role, but by how fully you return afterward. The industry rarely celebrates that return. But it should. Because the most dangerous myth in creative work is that losing yourself is the price of greatness. In reality, losing yourself is how greatness becomes unsustainable. This story isn't about a role that almost consumed someone. It's about what happens when someone goes far enough to understand the edge and chooses not to cross it again without protection. That choice doesn't weaken the art. It preserves the artist. And in a culture obsessed with extremes, that restraint is the most radical move of all. If this story made you rethink what dedication, transformation, and artistic sacrifice really mean, stay connected. On this channel, we don't just analyze performances, we explore what they cost, what they reveal, and what they teach about identity under pressure. Subscribe for deeper psychological breakdowns of iconic roles, celebrity transformations, and the unseen consequences of going all in. And if there's another performance you believe deserves this level of honest examination, tell us in the comments. Because the most powerful stories aren't about how far someone goes, they're about knowing when to come back.